Well, we know things have got serious when the Prime Minister is forced to cancel a much-needed summer holiday. We've had a Cobra meeting convened, but 6 days that have brought shame to Britain, parts of the UK still smouldering.
And with riots still going on in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister has said that anyone taking part in it will come to regret it. But given that these riots are taking place in white communities and with Muslim communities, mostly in the north of England, we need to ask, is the Prime Minister right to put all this down to far-right thuggery?
And if that wasn't controversial enough, we're also going to be discussing the Olympics and more specifically, the women's boxing. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla.
And I'm Tim Stanley.
So, Tim, welcome to the Daily Tea, standing in for Kamal on his second week of his holidays.
Right, so all right for some.
It's all right for some. But it's not really been the summer that Keir Starmer was anticipating because despite bringing peace and harmony and left-wing politics to Britain, parts of it are in flames, or at least have been over the weekend. Again on Sunday, the Prime Minister's forced to go to Downing Street to put on his suit and address the nation. This is what he said.
I utterly condemn the far-right thuggery we've seen this weekend. Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force of the law. The police will be making arrests, individuals will be held on remand, charges will follow, and convictions will follow.
Tim, we'll get on to the rhetoric in just a moment. Should he have cancelled his summer holiday?
It's worth remembering, first of all, when he entered number 10, he said he wanted to bring us together. And just the contrast between that ambition and those words he's just spoken is just so stark. I think he was right to cancel the holiday. Generally speaking, prime ministers should be allowed to take holidays. Of course, they need them. They're human. But of course, the problem is when he was in opposition, he told then Prime Minister Boris Johnson and then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab that they shouldn't have gone on holiday in 2021 when Afghanistan was falling.
Yes. So he has to be held accountable by his own standards.
Yeah, precisely.
And then we've got Nigel Farage, after Priti Patel called for Parliament to be recalled, calling for Parliament to be recalled.
Yeah.
A very enthusiastic MP for Clacton-on-Sea there, wanting to go back into Westminster. I mean, is that necessary? We've had this Cobra meeting convened. Cobra meaning Cabinet Office briefing rooms. Shades of COVID here, Tim.
Yeah. Well, look, Parliament might be necessary for some things like the question around prison spaces and some issues around the law when it comes to arresting people. So possibly, maybe they could do it by Zoom. They did that. You mentioned COVID. They did it by Zoom last time. But right now, this is about policing. It's about the executive proving that it's on top of things. I am a sketch writer, as you know. I don't trust MPs not to waffle and make this all about themselves. And I'm not sure what 2 weeks of MPs debating in the Commons, I'm not quite sure what that's going to add to this situation.
So as well as the press conference on Sunday, which obviously followed that statement earlier in the week, again where he's referring to far-right thuggery, and we will get onto that, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper was dispatched onto the airwaves this morning to bring some calm. Weirdly, though, Tim, interviewed by her own husband, Ed Balls, on Good Morning Britain.
Yeah, and I think nothing else summarises the gulf between Westminster and the rest, right? Where you can have a married couple interviewing each other and talking to each other. Nothing, I just think, speaks so directly to how distance Westminster is from the rest of the country.
Well, let's listen to Mr. and Mrs. Balls discussing the issue.
First thing to say is that the police have to operate without fear or favour, whatever the kinds of crimes it is that they face. And I have been clear, the government has been clear to the government, wherever they find criminality, thuggery, violence and abuse and extremism, wherever it comes from, whatever the source, they have to take strong, firm action, and they will have our full backing in doing so. It's really important that that takes place. It's why, for example, you referred to Hare Hills. There have already been, I think West Yorkshire Police have told me there have been about 27 arrests, and there are 4 people currently in custody with some of the most serious cases who are awaiting trial for those offences, and we have to make sure that action is taken there. But I do also think people try and use this as an excuse. They try and use this as an excuse to somehow justify the disgraceful behaviour this weekend from criminals. There is no excuse whatsoever for throwing bricks at police officers. There's no excuse whatsoever for trying to set light to a hotel when there were known to be people inside it at that time. This is extremely dangerous violence, and it just doesn't speak for people of Britain. I think right across the country there are people who are appalled by seeing those kinds of things.
Well, that was nice, wasn't it? You can imagine them having that conversation in the bathroom.
Yes.
Ed in the bath, her on the toilet.
Yeah.
And although he did his best at balance, and he's got that wonderful Ed Balls way of saying things like grievance, although he tried his best at balance, he cannot not be a former Labour frontbench politician
Yes.
asking a current Labour government minister what they think about an issue that we know they both agree about.
Also, it's kind of answering questions without really giving answers, which may explain some of this. At least, however, she did entertain the idea of answering the question,
Well done.
unlike Metropolitan Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley, who left the Cobra meeting and then this happened.
Are we going to end two-tier policing, sir?
And just to explain, that is the sound of the Met Commissioner batting away the microphone in the style of, you were reminded of Maggie Thatcher.
Yes, pushing poor old John Burt down the steps.
Yes, he didn't want to discuss that at all.
It's a rare example of hands-on policing in Britain. He can touch a microphone. They can't touch a rioter.
So he sort of stormed off. So clearly he doesn't want to answer those questions. What's your analysis of this, Tim, in general, particularly Starmer? I mean, has Starmer handled this well?
Yeah. First of all, can I just say, Camilla, you and I agree from the beginning to have a totally honest conversation about this. Because I feel in the last few days, partly because people are processing things moving so fast and so traumatic, that I feel people are being slightly restrained in what they say. And part of that's good civic attitude. But I think if we begin with the question of how Starmer's handled this, I mean, some people are saying, is he actually tough enough? He took a long time to have the Cobra meetings. And also he comes from the Labour Party, which for many years, some would say, have been watering down justice. And, you know, his new prisons minister doesn't believe in prisons, Lord Timpson, right? This is not good stuff. On the other hand, I think he's done a pretty good job of playing Prime Minister. He's approached this authoritatively in a very lawyerly way. I sense that this is a man who knows who to call when this kind of thing kicks off. He was, of course, Director of Public Prosecutions back in 2011 when we last had riots like this. Handled it quite well then, handled it quite well now. But, of course, when it comes to a protest like this, the proximate issue is to stop the disorder. But whenever there's a riot, you always at some point also have to pause and ask, why is the riot happening? And some people, like in that clip with Ed Balls, Richard Tice was mentioned, Reformers certainly said this, they feel that Keir Starmer is possibly actually making things worse by preemptively pinning the blame on quote-unquote right-wing thuggery. Now, there is definitely right-wing thuggery out there. There's no doubt about that. And I don't know about you,
Well,
but
not just right-wing thuggery. He's saying far right.
Sorry, excuse me, you're quite right. Far-right thuggery, which implies like a conspiracy-driven mob, right? And unquestionably it's there. And over the weekend, when we saw that hotel being set fire to, I just, my heart sank. I just thought, this is crystal knacked stuff. This is really dangerous. There's no doubt you need to address that. But is everyone out there far right? Is everyone out there far right? It is perfectly natural to be angry about that. And people feel, put aside the issue of immigration, people feel the state's not working, the state might even be against them, that they don't have law and order, and that politicians are not on top of things. And I think the turning point in all of this actually was when Keir Starmer visited Southport to lay some flowers, and he was heckled.
Yes.
I can't remember anything like that happening in my time. And not just was he heckled by someone, by the way, by local people, because there was a woman who was who was kept shouting and said, I knew those kids. So she's local. He was not only heckled, but no one said to the hecklers, shush. Normally, if you heckle, some people would say, shush.
Yeah, let him do his job.
I think she was speaking for how angry people are.
The biggest mistake he made with that incident, by the way, is not engaging with the hecklers and staying. He should have stayed rather than sort of walk off in the opposite direction. And I appreciate it's difficult and it's incendiary. But I think when you've got a community mourning like that and people just can't help but express themselves that vocally, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. We listen to it and we're slightly sort of cringing but understanding that passion that they feel for what has been an aberration on their own doorstep. So you can absolutely understand that visceral feeling. As a politician, you've got to just address that.
Yes.
You've got to go up to the people and say, listen, I can absolutely feel where you're coming from. I can hear your frustration. This has been the most appalling tragedy. You know, we will listen to your concerns. There needed to be far more of that. It was a bit too... I mean, he plays it safe, doesn't he?
Yes.
This loyaliness. There were the comments actually in some of the Sunday papers, in some of the leader columns, admittedly of some of the right-wing newspapers, making this point that he's very good at prosecuting a point, but not very good at finding solutions to it. This whole problem, we're saying we're going to have an open conversation and an honest conversation. Scenes of thugs tearing up communities, firebombing police stations or citizens' advice bureaus. I heard on the radio this morning that a library had been torched, which has done a really good job in a local community at getting disaffected youngsters into books. Presumably those very same youngsters may be the children of the so-called left behinds who haven't got enough educational opportunities. So that strikes me as just absolutely moronic. There is an aspect to it all where it's just Neanderthalic, moronic, horrifically thuggish, disruptive behaviour that actually makes me feel ashamed to be British.
Well, or ashamed to be human, because this happens. We've become France in the last few weeks, which is one of the most worrying things about this. But you know, behaviour reflects psychology. Why does a teen trash their room? Why does a dog tear up its bed? They do that because they want their space to look how they feel.
Yes.
Now, we have always acknowledged that with all rioting. We have acknowledged that in the past when ethnic minorities have rioted. We've acknowledged it in Northern Ireland. We've acknowledged it in America with the history of African-American rioting. We always go, it's bad, it must stop. But we acknowledge that people are trying to make their geography look like how they feel. Can we do that here? Are we allowed to do that here? Or because it's white working class people, racist, maybe many of them are we just going to stop the conversation there and say riots must stop, and now let's ask why they happened?
Well, let's put it this way. There are very many different reasons for people to riot, in the same way that there are very many different reasons for people to join a pro-Palestinian march. Okay? Some of it may be that they are just out and out racists. Some of it may be that they're coked up, drunk too much, and they just are spoiling for a fight and to criminally damage something. Another reason might be that they are unhappy about illegal migrants being housed in a hotel in their community if they are struggling through the cost of living crisis, struggling to put food on the table, and then see people arriving by boat and being given room and board. Okay? We're not justifying the action that they're taken. We're just trying to give an explanation for the behaviour. Labour's problem and Starmer's problem in all this is the Labour Party is meant to represent these people. The Labour Party is meant to represent white, working class, left behinds. And yet there's a complete disconnect there. I think you're right. I'm not sure nowadays they necessarily do represent those people, though. That's the only thing. Because of things like Brexit, it might be that the natural link between Labour and the white working class has already been cut in some of those areas. Well, who's filling the void? It's Farage.
It's quite possibly Farage. And I just want to... I'd like to say on that point, you made this very good point about why can't Starmer talk to people? Why can't Farage talk to people? If he does indeed represent and embody those people now and their aspirations and fears, maybe he should be out on the streets saying to them, don't stop rioting.
Well, he's not out on the streets. What he is on social media.
Right.
So the latest intervention, let's just pick out the kind of salient point here, which is a direct appeal, I think, to those communities that do feel left behind. The majority of our population can see the fracturing of our communities as a result of mass uncontrolled immigration, whether legal or illegal. Yet to attempt to debate this in the public arena leads to immediate howls of condemnation. A population explosion without integration was always going to end badly. I have said this for many years. He might be right if this is solely about immigration, but I think it's about much more than that.
I think it is, but I just want to say on the point about immigration that my view is, I think, and this is the bit where I'm being honest and therefore taking risks, I think human beings are instinctively tribal. I think they like generally to stick to their own kind. Now, you can have a certain degree of migration, which is absolutely fine and indeed beneficial and no complaint, so long as it's managed. The problem is if you have large amounts of immigration, it's not just a debate about what effect does it have upon wages. It's not just a debate about all that sort of economic stuff. It's also what do people actually feel comfortable with. And I think the reality is in some of those communities is they are saying, we don't like this. We don't like this pace of immigration. And some people who are sold upon the idea that actually you can put up with any level of immigration because, hey, we're all human beings. The world is global now. We can all move around. And that's really exciting, especially if you're rich and white collar. Those people just think, well, then you're just a racist person. And okay, maybe we call that racism, maybe we call it nativism. I don't know, but it's innate, it's there. And if you don't prepare for it, you are going to create the conditions that we've just seen and you're going to have a riot.
I mean, I'm conscious that we're two white British people discussing an issue that is quite nuanced and complex. And my impression of that conversation is if you were going back to the 60s, 70s, even the 80s when you and I grew up in school, people were extremely hostile to people with black or brown skin.
Yeah.
I think the hostility has changed and it isn't directed at the individuals. I think a lot of it's directed at a state it thinks has failed.
Yes.
People in this country by allowing so many people to come in without providing the infrastructure to support it.
Yes.
So it's gone from a conversation about you don't look like me, you're not British, I don't like the colour of your skin, sort of the kind of ain't half hot mum sort of rhetoric.
Yeah.
And that's turned into you are prioritising people coming in from overseas and their needs and giving them more economic help than I am receiving.
Yes.
I cannot get a doctor's or a dentist appointment and I'm having to extract teeth with a pair of pliers in the garage because 9 million people have come here in the last 2 parliaments. You should have built more housing. You should have built more schools. You should have built more facilities. And I am now extremely resentful of you failing. And by the way, you've done all this even though I have voted for successive governments, both of blue and red persuasion, promising that the numbers will come down. And in fact, they've gone up.
And rather than then doing a U-turn on policy and correcting, Labour and Tory governments have said to the people effectively, no, you're wrong.
And you're racist.
And you're racist. And that only makes people more angry. We're like a Soviet regime by the late 80s, in which the public are saying, I don't like this, it doesn't work. And the regime is actually doubling down on the socialist propaganda and saying, actually, it's working really well. And we're just a generation from it working, just being brilliant. And people can see that it's not. And that's one reason why you get rioting, because if people feel they can't communicate their anger through democracy, if people feel they can't trust the police to be even-handed, which is why the two-tier policing accusation cuts so much, then what else are they going to do? And I repeat, that is what we would have said, and I have said, if there were ever any ethnic minority violence and rioting. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to say.
Yes.
If black communities feel they're being picked on by the police, and if they feel they can't communicate and they can't trust the police, they will riot. The riot has to then be controlled. But in the past, like in the early 80s, we have always then said, okay, so what was the grievance? And this is why we now have, like, the police is now dedicated to being anti-racist because of that historical experience. So are we going to do the same with this riot? Or are we just going to say, you know what, this is a Nazi conspiracy? Is that where we're going to stop?
Tom, but this is the other dimension that has been exacerbated since 2011, right? I was looking back on the history of 2011 and when it came to sort of social media and tech giants being blamed, who was blamed? Twitter, as it was then known, and BlackBerry Messenger. Because apparently some of the far-right organisers of the riots were communicating via that now defunct medium. Now we've got a situation that Robinson, from his holiday in Cyprus, is apparently tweeting and reposting about 15 times an hour.
Right.
We've got tech giants. Tech giants have completely lost control of their own platforms.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Nothing happened to cracking down on the misinformation that was spread around after Southport.
Yeah.
And actually repeated by some sitting MPs, one of which we've already mentioned, Nigel Farage.
And the owner of Twitter, some would say, is actually feeding disinformation
so
by
Elon
tweeting
Musk,
things about Britain descending into a civil war and stuff like that.
Okay, so we've got that all going on in the background. And then, so that's sort of a perfect storm, isn't it? Sort of tech giants not taking any responsibility, seemingly, for people just spewing and spreading complete nonsense. And we've got a situation where parts of the public appear to have lost faith, rightly or wrongly, in the police.
Yeah.
And I don't think, by the way, that's just to do with two-tier and how have they policed the Palestinian marches and how are they policing this and how did they respond to the Colston statue being turfed over into the water in Bristol. It's also a symptom, I think, of a general sense of lawlessness.
Yes.
You know, people getting mugged in broad daylight for their Rolex watches and nothing really happening.
And it's really not just a working class concern.
No.
A lot of middle class people feel exactly the same way, which is kind of a historical change because traditionally the middle class were kind of really supportive of the police.
And living in fear of the police a little bit.
Right. But what has changed that is partly because at least since Black Lives Matter marches, we've received the message that rioting or demonstrating is okay. And the police will stand back and allow it to play out. So that sends a clear message anyone who's tempted to riot.
Was it rioting? Protest is okay.
Protest, okay.
But maybe people have pushed the boundaries of what protest is. The other factor is Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil.
So in the case of...
That's changed the complexion. Criminality and criminal damage is okay.
In the case of Bristol, they threw a statue into the water and a jury then acquitted them. Right. So what is the message there?
But you'd rather a statue being thrown than a firebomb being thrown.
Of course, they are very different things, but we all know how the wedge thickens. We know that you start by saying, look, in principle, the police will not automatically stop something, or in principle, a jury is open to letting you off doing something.
Yes.
Then you just gradually unwind.
Roger Hallam grinds the M25 to a halt for 4 days, and now you've got 1,500 lovies signing a letter saying he shouldn't have been sentenced for 5 years.
And I know a lot of people think that we centre-righties are obsessed by things like police going on pride marches, but the message it sends is the police are not are not fundamentally serious, and B, have decided that there are things to do with their time other than nabbing criminals. And it reduces trust because you look at the police and you don't look at them as a dispassionate figure of authority anymore, but you see them as a politicized figure. And if you don't happen to share their politics, am I going to be treated objectively by this policeman because I disagree with him about something?
I mean, the scene of the police being in retreat in Hare Hills, which obviously predicated Southport, was one of the most depressing things I've seen in quite some time.
And it might have been the right thing to do.
It might have been the right thing. But we should discuss that. Yeah. This whole two-tier policing, the police have got to police different events in different ways.
Obviously, yes.
You're going to have a different approach to a bunch of football hooligans turning up and tearing up a town than you're going to have to a load of female protesters in hijabs calling for more to be done about the suffering in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah, of course you're going to do it differently. But having said that, during COVID, when you had the protest led by feminists against the handling of the murder of
Sarah Everard.
Sarah Everard, forgive me, that was treated, they really cracked down on that. They were very hands-on with that. And again, those scenes stick in people's minds and give the impression that the police are either doing this ad hoc or it's a question of which groups they happen to agree with. I mean, that was obviously a COVID-era thing. The police were very keen on enforcing that.
Pull the conversation around full circle then. I mean, barring really wet weather, which will stop the riots practically overnight, let's be honest. If it actually starts pouring down with rain, nobody riots in rain. It's a weird phenomena. What more can Starmer do? We've sort of agreed that we think he's mishandled this.
By the way, I don't think he's entirely... I think procedurally he's got it right. I think rhetorically he's got it wrong.
Right.
So there's a famous moment in 1968 during the Democratic presidential primaries when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy touched down in Indiana, and he was addressing a crowd, mostly of African Americans, and he was passed a note saying Martin Luther King has just been shot. And he addressed the crowd, and he talked to them about losing his own brother, trauma, grief, anger, and how pointless it is to channel that anger into violence. And famously, over the course of the next week, there were riots everywhere except Indiana.
Yeah.
Because Bobby Kennedy had talked people down.
But is Starmer capable of that?
No, I don't think he's capable of that. There is a lack of poetry in this country and in our politics. And it's dismissed by a lot of people. Now, because Labour is all about delivery.
Yeah.
This is their key word. People don't care what we really say. They just want to see us doing competence.
Delivery.
We're just going to run things really well. And yeah, that's great, because for many years we were run by people who didn't know what on earth they were doing. But actually, you need a bit of poetry. You need to say to people, can't we all get along? You need to do that. And I'm not sure if he's yet capable of giving that speech.
Coming up next, we're going to discuss whether we can all get along with the idea of boxers who identify as female having XY chromosomes and whether they should compete at the Olympics. Have you been watching the women's boxing, Tim?
No.
Right.
I don't watch any Olympics. I loathe it.
Oh. Oh no! What are you watching instead?
I was very
How are you
pleased-
escaping
I was
the
very
coverage?
pleased with a line in one of my columns where I said every year now they sing Imagine, and there's a line in Imagine that says, "Imagine there's no countries." Well, if there were no countries, there'd be no Olympics, and that'd be great because I could get my telly back. I just find Olympics just ruins the TV.
You weren't somebody who was sporty at school, are you?
No, not at all. No, I hated sport, and I just have no desire to watch muscle-bound people throw sticks and balls around all day.
Having said that,
Fascinating
are across-
conversation coming up.
No. Having said that, you are across this issue.
Oh,
with,
yes,
Of
yes,
course, because we've
yes.
had to cover it.
Yeah.
So, we've had 2 Olympic women's boxers, Iman Khalif from Algeria and then Lin Yuting from Taiwan. They're both through to the semi-finals of the women's boxing, but that has sparked a huge amount of controversy because they both failed gender tests, which caused them to be disqualified from the World Championships last year. The World Championships are run by the IBA, the International Boxing Association. They say that they tested positive for XY chromosomes, which would suggest that they're both biologically male. But the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has said no, they both identify as women. They were brought up as women and they have women on their passports and therefore they can compete in the women's category. But having both defeated opponents that said that they've never felt like they've been smashed so hard in the face and elsewhere in their lives, it sparked a row. J.K. Rowling, Sharon Davies, Martina Navratilova, all of these gender-critical voices and feminists have sort of waded into this. For what it's worth, I think that the IOC has almost shot itself in the foot on this. We heard from the president, Thomas Bach, who didn't seem to be clear himself the difference between transgenderism and indeed cases where there are differences in sex development, DSD. So he gives his press conference saying, both of these women are women because it says so on their passports and they've been raised as female. And actually, this is not a DSD case, he said. This is about a woman taking part in a women's competition. And I think I have explained this many times. Afterwards, he then had to backtrack and say, sorry, what I meant is it's not a transgender case. So he seems very confused. And there doesn't seem to be an acknowledgement of the following point. Surely biology must trump gender self-identification. We've got cases of people who have to choose a gender because they may have been born into indiscriminate sex. So it's chosen for them at birth by their parents. They'll be brought up male or female. And of course, we respect those decisions and we respect people's right to refer to themselves as the gender they want to be. And by the way, I've no problem at all using pronouns. When it comes to competing in a sport as dangerous as boxing, however, it really is important if some boxers have XY chromosomes and are therefore biologically male in their traits, are then fighting people with XX chromosomes who are female, because men can punch 2.5 times harder than women. They're physiologically stronger, and therefore it can literally be dangerous for female athletes. My argument is you put women's safety ahead of any sensibility around whether someone is male or female. Does that make sense, Tim?
It does. I broadly agree, but you use the phrase self-ID, and of course Khalif has not self-ID'd.
No.
She, as far as she's concerned, is a woman who was raised as a woman. It's just that things might be complicated biologically and chromosomally, but this is not a classic trans case of someone who was born a man, then became a woman,
No.
and is now trying to compete in that particular sport. And that's the nature of being intersex. Now, I looked into this because I hate sport, but I like politics, and the history of this is fascinating, that in 1928, when women were finally allowed to compete at the Olympics, for the first time in things like a few track events, almost immediately the press started saying, that's not a woman. It became a controversial issue from almost day one. And then by 1936, they started introducing a form of testing, which was a physical inspection, because people were so concerned that men were actually performing as women. And there's an example of 2 athletes who were singled out, Stella Walsh, a Polish-born sprinter with US citizenship, and Helen Stevens, an American. And if you look at photographs of them, look, they're quite masculine looking.
Yes.
And that's what people picked up on. They were also bitter rivals. And Walsh accused Stevens of being a man in order to win. win. And interestingly, when Walsh was killed in 1980, there was an autopsy that discovered that it was actually Walsh who was intersex.
Oh.
So, from that point on, the Olympics started individually testing people, which was essentially a strip test, and things got so kind of mad and invasive that in 1966, for the European Athletics Championship, they introduced panel-based testing, whereby women would be forced to strip completely naked and be inspected by a panel of people. And every single athlete, regardless of whether they were perceived to be masculine or not, was compelled to do this. So when the chromosome test was introduced in 1968, this was actually regarded as a more chivalrous alternative.
But it is, isn't it? I mean, parading people naked is absolutely preposterous.
But the problem with the chromosome test is it then very neatly divides into XX and XY. And part of the problem with intersex people is you could theoretically be born XY, but you look like, live as a woman, and as far as you are concerned, you are a woman. So what do we then do with that person? So I think the whole controversy raises two interesting questions. One, what is a natural sporting advantage? Think back to the Oscar Pistorius case. Oscar Pistorius wanted to race against I'm trying to find the right word for this. He didn't have his legs. He wanted to race against people who had their legs.
Yes.
But he was barred from doing it because he used plastic sort of kind of legs, which people said gave him an unnatural advantage. So again, this is an old debate about what is a natural, what is an unnatural sporting advantage. But the other debate it taps into is what is a woman? And for the last couple of years, we've been sort of pinning politicians down and saying, tell me what a woman is. And they've all developed this answer as an adult human female. But actually, this is a great, and it may turn out to be quite a tragic example of someone who doesn't quite fit into that category.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that all our lives should be rewritten, the code of our lives should be rewritten in order to make that one person feel comfortable and able to participate. That's an example of the tyranny of the minority. What I am saying is, these people, intersex people, have always existed in every culture and at every time. They are a physical reality. So what do we then do with them? And if we're going to have an Olympics in which people can compete of both genders, where do we place the intersex people?
Well, I think that the response to that is that there needs to be consistency. And this is the problem. Because when they were disqualified by the IBA, which, by the way, is steeped in its own controversy because it's run by the Russians and it's been found guilty or at least suspected of corruption and goodness knows what else. Okay, so that is tricky in itself. However, when those two boxers were disqualified for failing gender tests, they didn't appeal those disqualifications. And that was then taken as them accepting that they had the XY chromosomes, which would then disqualify them from competing in a female category. You then get to the IOC, and the waters are muddied because the IOC starts taking an ideological as opposed to a biological approach in its decision as to whether to enter them into the female category or not. That then rightly angers female sports people, female sports women, who rightly say, hang on a minute, they can't compete in the World Championships, but they can compete at the Olympics. We don't know where we stand here. We don't know whether we are safe in the ring with some of these opponents. I mean, in Khalif's case, she had fought a Mexican opponent who literally said that she was being hit with blows like she'd never felt before.
But Khalif has also been beaten by female competitors.
Khalif has been beaten by females. And it may be the case that both of these boxers don't end up in the final.
Yeah.
But the Sharon Davies argument is have a category for trans and intersex.
Right.
Would that be fair? Are there enough people competing in that, guys?
Okay, maybe that is the solution, but I'm a conservative, I'm a Catholic. I have very clear biblical views about gender, right? But our society says if you are trans or intersex and you identify as male or female, you are male or female. We treat you as male or female. In which case, we can't pull off this appalling double standard of saying to trans people, if you want to become married, okay, you are now a man or a woman, good for you, except here, 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 and here. But then you are creating a weird discrimination against people who, in all other regards, our society is saying is definitely what they present themselves to be.
When we talk about physiology or maybe kind of quirks in the human system that have helped some athletes. For instance, this thing about Michael Phelps. He's won more gold medals, I believe, than 162 countries combined.
Yeah.
And he's got this thing where he doesn't produce lactic acid, so he doesn't then cramp up in the pool and he can go longer and faster than anyone else. Now, in one respect, you could look at that as an unfair advantage, but not necessarily something that can be measured. If he was drugs tested and it revealed that he had taken a performance enhancing substance, then obviously he could face disqualification.
Yeah.
We have to ask ourselves whether these boxers who are showing abnormally high levels of testosterone, it would be bad if women tested for abnormally high levels of testosterone, who were female and had literally drugged up, then they would face disqualification.
But Camilla, if your advantage is coming from taking drugs, then it's an unnatural advantage. If your advantage is your body naturally produces a lot of drugs, so you've got very long legs or very long arms, that's a natural advantage. And my understanding of sport, which I can only repeat, I hate, my understanding of sport is that it's really all about nature. And it's about biology, and it's not good to one's feelings.
So
it's just simply
biology,
this person is born with this advantage.
So if it's about biology and you have XY chromosomes, then you should be competing in the male category. And I'm saying there would be an innate unfairness if a woman was disqualified because it was found that she had been taking testosterone to improve
but if you had an ex-woman who happens to have a lot of testosterone,
no, I know, but
we're not going to disqualify her. We're going to say, well done, you've got this natural gift that we're all going to celebrate.
Yeah, but there are limits on the amount of testosterone I believe that is acceptable.
Right.
And drugs testing does take into account people that have taken hormones to increase improvement. So I'm saying there is something unfair perhaps about, if you're going to go down this line of inquiry, a woman who had taken excess testosterone to improve performance being disqualified by a drugs test, but a woman who has had a test that has revealed abnormal amounts of testosterone being able to compete because she is intersex or she identifies as female on her passport.
Okay, and it may turn out that ultimately Kelef is deemed to be intersex. She cannot compete. We have to have equality. I agree with you. I just come back to I feel really sorry for her because this is not a normal trans case. This is someone who, as far as they are concerned, and indeed I think I would say is a woman. This is where the definitions get pretty tricky because, for goodness sake, they grew up in a really conservative Muslim society. They were raised as a woman, they lived as a woman, they competed as a woman. And ultimately, maybe this has to be taken away from them for everyone else's sake. Maybe. But it kind of sucks, doesn't it? And I feel uncomfortable with this being presented as a fraud. I think some people are leaping on this as a con, that this is someone who has maliciously manipulated their advantage in order to get ahead. And they enjoy beating up women. I'm uncomfortable with that.
She's given an interview to Algerian television when she said that the scrutiny to which she has been subjected at the Olympics harms human dignity.
And you know, I think one reason why I'm sympathetic towards her is chivalry. I don't like this gaze at the female body. I don't like this obsession with what's going on under your skirt that so many people have developed. As I say, my views on gender are pretty straight. There's male and female, and apart from some miracles of nature, not in between. But I don't like policing people's bodies in this way, and I think it's very uncomfortable.
I have to go off on a slight tangent. And maybe this is something that would interest you more about the Olympics, because it's not necessarily sporting, it's to do with flags.
Oh, yes.
Because a Daily Tea listener has got in touch. They wanted to remain anonymous, which is fine, saying the following. I'm sure many of your listeners secretly share my slight dismay to see an array of upside-down Union flags at the Olympics. This has been most obvious at the swimming, where the enthusiastic bearers are clearly not signalling distress. Can the Daily Tea gently nudge our otherwise tremendous British fans to fly the flag broadside up? I would have contacted the BBC, but I suspect they wouldn't know the difference. I love that final sort of dig at the BBC, which is very telegraphian, if I may say.
Ticks every box.
Have you noticed upside-down flags, Tim? It's the kind of thing you would notice if you don't mind me saying.
No, would you know which way was the right way around?
I am so bad at flags that when I was on Celebrity Pointless, I used the word celebrity quite loosely there with Rachel Johnson. The first round came up. It was flags. We are the first and only contestants in Celebrity Pointless history that both got red crosses. We misidentified 2 flags in a row and were turfed out in the first round.
Okay.
So if I ever go to a pub quiz and I see flags that need to be labelled, I literally just leave the quiz. Enough's enough. You don't need me here, I'm going.
Most of them are tricolours of some variety or a cross, so of course it's easy to mix them up. The best flag in our wonderful country is, of course, the Welsh one with the dragon. And I just think it's a pity we can't stick a dragon on the Union Jack, because then no one would make this error.
Yes.
You can't possibly hold a dragon the
No,
wrong
you
way
can't
upside
have
down.
No, you can't have an
And I
upside
think it
down
would also
dragon.
send a message to the other countries. I don't know what, but
No, it's
don't muck
but we
about
are
with
scary.
us.
Very Game of Thrones.
Don't mess about
I
with
love
us.
that. Tim, Weetabix,
Yeah.
do you partake?
No, I don't. Partly because it was something that I was force-fed when I was a child, along with cod liver. So I always think Weetabix, I just think is horrible. I'm sure it's absolutely delicious if you ate it again now.
I'm only asking because this is a story that has garnered, a surprising amount of comments
Yeah.
and reaction on the Telegraph website. There are sometimes those stories. I think one of the best performing articles on the Telegraph website was your gut health or something. What probiotic drinks to drink to make sure that you have good gut health. It's like, forget, US election, UK election, serious news.
But you know, if you ever want a column to fly, you stick something in it about how do I fix my microwave or what's the name of this tree. That's what's actually going to make a column fly.
I actually had the best reaction ever to a problem with box blight. I
Yep.
got those green caterpillars and I've never had more letters come in advising me how to treat it.
The headline was quite simple. Is Weetabix healthy? And the responses are extraordinary. I'll give you some examples. Anonymous said, imagine being so self-obsessed about what you eat that you consider a Weetabix to be dangerous. People need to get a life and get out more instead of obsessing. I actually agree with that one. D. Allen says, as a child, I used to butter them
What?
and then add warm milk and caster sugar. Experts can't believe I'm still alive. And someone who we should call AM says, leave Weetabix alone. I have many memories of fighting with my brother to get the bottle of milk first so I could pour the cream on the top of the milk onto my cereal.
I cannot believe somebody has been buttering Weetabix for years. However,
What can I just say? When you look at photos of them from the past of people on beaches, they're all really thin.
yes,
How? Because the diet 30
Yeah.
or 40 years ago was gross.
they were basically eating lard with a spoon.
Yes, I was raised on beef burgers and chips. I
Yes.
don't know why I look the way
And
I
Findus
do.
crispy pancakes and spam. Claire Greswell has got an interesting way of eating Weetabix that I think it must be shared with the Daily Tea audience because this is important highbrow news. I grew up eating Weetabix, she says, when original was the only option, and I even belonged to the Weetabix Club. If you know what's good for you, was the tagline. I still have the mug, bowl and plate set and Weetabix tin, one had to save up for tokens from the packaging, in my kitchen cupboard and use them all these years later. I even remember the characters' names from the Neat Wheat Club, Dunk, Crunch, Brains, Brian and Bixie. Now I'd like to share our producer Lillian's story of Weetabix
Yeah.
because her family got so into Weetabix that they invented a new term and brace yourself, Tim. They didn't put the Weetabix in a bowl and pour milk on like ordinary folk.
Yeah.
Oh, no. They had their Weetabix and they dunked them like biscuits
Yeah.
into a cup of milk
Right.
to ensure that they didn't go soggy. And then they called that process Dipperbix.
Right.
Is
you
that
see,
weird?
I think that's the most horrific thing we discussed in the last half hour. I mean, that should be banned. Never mind the rioting and intersex athletes. This is what we should be calling the police about.
To be fair, how would you conventionally eat cereal?
You put it in the bowl and then you put the milk on it.
Yeah, I had a friend whose dad insisted on putting the milk in the bowl and then adding the cereal.
Right, like getting tea the wrong way round.
Should they be arrested for crimes against breakfast?
No, just ostracize them.
Indeed.
Just get a mob outside the window chanting slogans.
Can I just clarify that this podcast has not been sponsored by Weetabix? Other breakfast cereals are available.
As I mentioned, I don't like it.
And if you do have a Weetabix or other cereal tale to tell, do get in touch. Email us at thedailytea@telegraph.co.uk or you can get in contact via our socials, darling, at Daily Tea Podcast. And we're on X, Instagram and TikTok. Tim, we're done for our first day in the hot
enjoyed it.
seat. Have you enjoyed it?
I enjoyed it.
Will
Thank
you stay for the
having
week?
me. Yeah, no, I'll come back again.
That's great. We'll see you.
I probably won't leave.
Don't
I'll just
leave.
sleep here overnight and
Why
I'll be
not?
here in the morning.
And we've got some some Tory leadership candidates
Oh,
coming
wow.
in. Yeah,
Well, that'll wake me up.
which you'll enjoy, from sketching to interrogating. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m.